Hi, I'm Stephen Capsuto. I'm a full-time professional translator, and I recently translated this wonderful book from Spain called When Einstein Met Kafka, Jewish Contributions to the Modern World. And it is as you can see, a fairly large book, and I am with the author, Diego Moldes. Diego is in Madrid, and today we're going to talk about one section of the book which deals with Jewish contributions to literature, Jewish authors, well-known authors, not so well-known authors, and he tells us about many writers I had never heard of. One of the nice things about this book is because Diego is European, he has a little bit of a broader view than some of us here in America have of the world, and introduces us to writers we may not know. So, hi Diego, how are you doing?
Hi, Stephen. How are you? Thanks. I'm very happy to be talking with you about what we both love most, which is books, right? Literature.
I should mention that each of us, as we record this, is speaking in our own language, and what you are seeing is a video with Diego dubbed into English. So, okay, go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate it because although I can read and write English and I understand it when you speak, you know that my English pronunciation and syntax are pretty bad. So this AI system is a surprise for me, but I think it's the most practical way to do what we're trying to do, which is introduce people in the United States, in your country, to this book. And honestly, it's a joy to start with literature because, well, as I say in the introduction to the book, there is a whole universe of writers in the world, countless hundreds and thousands of authors. But among the greats, among the first-rate ones who get translated, once again we see disproportionately impressive achievements by so many Jewish writers and by writers of recent Jewish ancestry in the literature of every known modern language. In the most widely read and translated languages, such as English, French, Spanish, German, and Italian, but also in languages less well known in the West, such as Russian, Polish, Czech, and so on, it is truly surprising. Of course, I won't forget Yiddish and Hebrew logically enough, but it's not just those. And I really try to explore that in the book. But perhaps the two longest chapters, where I spend the most time with micro essays, are, as you know, the ones about literature and film. So let's start with literature. And where better to start than with Kafka, right? After all, the book is called When Einstein Met Kafka because of something that I learned when I visited the Café Louvre in Prague in 2011, which is that in 1911, 100 years before my first trip to Prague, Franz Kafka and Albert Einstein had met at the cultural salons held in that cafe. It's a beautiful two-story venue where people play chess and billiards and foosball, and Albert Einstein also used to play the violin there. That's documented, and Kafka, I think, is the quintessentially iconic author, isn't he? So it seemed perfectly fitting to give Jewish writers their due by starting with this paradigmatic 20th century author, who I consider the greatest, most influential writer of his century. I agree with Borges, who said the same thing. Borges used to say that within 1,000 years, every author and every book will have disappeared, but Kafka's stories will pass into an oral tradition and survive, even if no one remembers Kafka himself anymore. In the same way that today, we don't know who wrote the great text of the Torah, or who wrote many Greek texts, even though those mythical stories are still passed down from generation to generation.
I really enjoyed translating this chapter because this chapter and the movies chapter, because I was sitting there obviously on my computer typing away and doing the translation, but I also had a piece of paper next to me where as I was going, oh, that author sounds really interesting. I got to track down her books or his books. And I made like lists. And then in my spare time, I was either reading or listening to audiobooks of people like Cynthia Ozick and Angel Wagenstein. And I really want to read Gabi Gleichmann because you have that whole interview you did with him.
Yes.
And what's the book called? The
Elixir of Immortality.
The Elixir of Immortality, right, which is available in English also. So I was making lists of what's available in languages I know and then running out and reading them. I think my favorite thing that I read that you recommended was something by Cynthia Ozick. You wrote rather a lot about her, and I had heard of her, but I didn't know exactly what she wrote, and I wound up reading her novel, Foreign Bodies, and I just thought that was phenomenal. And I also read parts of Wallant's The Pawnbroker, which I had never read before, and it's I much appreciate you. I'm Jewish and I know a lot of Jewish writers, but you sort of like opened doors to me that I didn't know about.
The Pawnbroker is also a curious example. In the Spanish edition published by Acantilado, it says in the foreword that many of your fellow New Yorkers, whether native New Yorkers or transplants, have never heard of this author. And that includes many Jewish New Yorkers since the city has a big Jewish population. I'm surprised he's not well known there. It's like that old saying, the shoemaker's children have no shoe.
Well, also, he died so young that he didn't.
Yes,
The list of books he wrote are very short.
true, but as you know, it's a book that was adapted into a film by Sidney Lumet, a very famous New York filmmaker, starring Rod Steiger. And it was the first commercial film to depict the traumas of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. And that's why I assumed the book was well known in the US, but it isn't. There's something that you, as a translator, know all about, but the general American public is unaware of, which is how very few translations get published in the United States and Canada, right? That doesn't mean that Europeans read more than Americans do. It's just that we read a wider variety of authors who write in more languages than readers anywhere else in the world. For instance, out of all the books published in the US, barely 2% are translations from other languages.
It's a little lower now. It's now probably like 3 to 5% with
5%, that's still very low. In Spain, you go into any bookstore and you find Spanish translations of thousands of authors, thousands, who write in hundreds of different languages. Not only the 10 or 12 most widely spoken languages, but also minority languages. All over Europe, translation schools are producing graduates who translate books from African languages and the indigenous languages of the Americas and Asia, you know? That's very rare in the US, isn't it? So we're lucky that, for instance, when publishers put out their weekly list of new releases here, suddenly you'll happen across a Bulgarian writer like Angel Wagenstein, who you mentioned, or Gabi Gleichmann, who's a Swedish-Norwegian author and writes in both languages, who's the son of Hungarian Jews. Or, I don't know, maybe Danilo Kish, who, as you know, was from the former Yugoslavia, which doesn't even exist anymore, right? And in our bookshops, all these Jewish authors and authors from Jewish backgrounds, Marcel Proust, Stefan Zweig, and many contemporary ones, are part of a mixture where there's no discrimination on the basis of language or nationality. It's more about the type of literature. I'll give you a prime example. Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who you know just won the Nobel Prize in Literature this year, has said that until he was 13 or 14 years old, his family never told him that his father was Jewish. They hid it from him because there was so much anti-Semitism in Hungary in the communist era in the 50s and 60s. He illustrates my point. I think most of the books by this Nobel Prize winner have been available in Spanish translations for over 20 years, though maybe not in other languages yet. Maybe now they're coming out in English, I don't know. But there are so very many authors who we are lucky to be able to read in our own language, Spanish or even Galician or Catalan. The same happens in France, the same happens in Germany, almost the same thing happens in Italy. It really gives you an edge in having a perspective on culture that's more multicultural or more hybrid.
a broader view. I mean, Americans, yeah, we sometimes are a little bit inward looking. And as you said, very few publications here are translations. I was surprised when I was in Spain last time, the number of classic Yiddish writers that you can find their books in Spanish. You can read Kulvak and Bergelson and Bashevis and all of those people and many more in Spanish translations.
For instance, Robert Mandel, our publisher, said in an email that among 20th century Jewish women writers, Clarice Lispector was comparable to what Kafka was among the men. She was on that level. Of course, her entire body of work has been translated into Spanish and published in Spain by Ciruela.
And a lot of her work is available in English, but it's very, a lot of it is seen as very specialized, that it's, yes, if you're a scholar, you'll read Clarice Lispector, and she's this huge iconic figure in Brazilian literature. And I think people here have heard of her, but have not read her. Yeah. And she's also sometimes a little difficult to read sometimes.
Yes, well, because it is a difficult literature, isn't it? The same thing happens, for example, with Cynthia Ozick, who you just mentioned. Recently, I was rereading The Pagan Rabbi here at home, That is one of the most biting and I think most transgressive stories in American literature. Not just in Jewish-themed fiction, but in U.S. literature as a whole. And I asked myself, why isn't she as well known as Philip Roth or Paul Auster? Why? Probably only because she's a woman. Because honestly, her books, such as the Putter-Messer Papers, are truly wonderful. And she's also an author who isn't very well known in Spain either, but she started being translated about 15 years ago and has been read quite a bit. Also, I have here, if you don't mind, an example from another author you're familiar with, who I cite in the book, and it's actually 2 books. I bought this edition in Paris and this one in Madrid at the Alberti bookstore. and the French version by Georges Perec is titled La Disparición. In Spanish, it was translated as El Secuestro, the kidnapping. And as you see on the cover, there's a letter A. The original French book by Perec, La Disparition, is a book, a novel, that never uses the most common vowel in the French language, which is E. And in its Spanish version, translated by several translators over the course of many years, the letter that's never used is the most frequently used letter, or vowel rather, in Spanish, which is A. It tells you something when even a book as odd as this one by Perec has been translated into Spanish for quite some time. So I think that has allowed us Spanish-speaking readers, of which Spain comprises only 8%. As you know, Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, with 600 million speakers, and we are just 8%, right? But all Spanish speakers, including 60 million in the US, can read Jewish authors who write in many different languages, thanks to these translations.
One of the things that really struck me about your book is that aside from the narrative you write, is you quote from a lot of other books. And a lot of the books that you quote from, especially in the section about literature where people are writing about these authors, you're quoting from books that are not available in English, which in some ways made my job harder, in some ways made it easier. But for example, in your discussion of the French novelist and playwright Nathalie Sarraute, where you're talking about, you have all this really interesting stuff, and then you quote from a book by Galateria, where she's talking about this aspect of Nathalie Sarraute's life, aside from, her literature, that during the Nazi occupation of France, she was a lawyer. Her husband, who wasn't Jewish, was a lawyer. And once the Nazis took over, it was illegal for Jews or anyone who was married to a Jew to practice law. And so she and her husband divorced, and she posed as their daughter's nanny, who the girls called Mademoiselle. And we wouldn't, I can't, well, I can, but a lot of people wouldn't be able to read Galateria's book in the original Italian. But because you quote from her, now we have access to this sort of story in English. And there are so many other stories in the book where you're pulling from these disparate sources in different languages and giving us entree into those worlds, which I really appreciate.
My friend Alejandro Jodorowsky, who is a filmmaker and writer and is also Jewish, who has lived many years, he's now 96, always tells me that culture comes from curiosity, that curiosity is the driving force that creates all culture, from your childhood to old age. You are an example of that. I think I am too. And what motivated me in all these examples, like the ones you mentioned, Nathalie Sarraute and many others, is the curiosity that defined those lives. Because today, we live a life, at least in the West, that is comparatively comfortable, with living conditions that, despite all the problems of this century, are admirable, right? It's true, there are wars. Yes, a lot of bad things happen in the world, like climate change, but we largely lead comfortable lives. But those who were born in the 19th century or during the interwar period had to live through a lot of hardship, through 2 world wars with 60 million deaths, through anti-Semitism, pogroms in the Russian Empire, revolutions in Europe and the Americas and Asia, of course, and in Africa. And I believe that all these authors are the product of an era, of a life that, for better or worse, is unrepeatable and laid the foundations of modernity, of contemporary modernity. Not the modernity that started with the printing press, not the modernity that launched in the 15th century with the discovery of the New World, because that's all about Columbus, but rather the modernity of our contemporaries. We read these authors as if the characters were our siblings, as if they were our parents, our friends, who come alive in those novels by all these Jewish authors. We recognize them and are moved by them. And that's not easy. I think Jews, in their diaspora, in their many diasporas, have also had to develop a very keen sense of observation in order to comprehend the world. Primo Levi used to say that more important than understanding was comprehending, because understanding is something bidirectional. I understand you, you understand me, that's communication. But to comprehend implies something much greater. It means to encompass, to grasp in its entirety. In other words, to recognize everything you are seeing and to interpret it. And I think that, of course, not only Jews, but Jewish writers of the 19th and 20th centuries have done this in a very heterogeneous, very diverse and admirable way in terms of forms, structures, and originality. The clearest example is Kafka. Here I have For example, an edition by Paco Roca that I had right there, which I just found now, it's the Metamorphosis, with drawings by a Spanish illustrator who's very well known here in Spain, Paco Roca. And the stories that the world's great creators dream up continue clamoring for those of us who are artists, film directors, musicians, composers, or theater directors to reinterpret those myths. Another facet of literature, and I apologize, Stephen, if I'm going on for too long, is the visions of pacifists. The clearest example, which I quote at the start of the book, is Stefan Zweig and his famous memoir, The World of Yesterday. As you know, he and his wife died by suicide in Petropolis, Brazil, believing they were going to lose the war and that the Nazis would occupy the entire planet. And so, unfortunately, they ended their own lives. But his book, in a way, captures that legacy that I tried to bring into my own book. And by the way, it goes without saying, but it reflects that steady drip, that brain drain from Europe to North America. That is very clear.
I was struck also by, you include excerpts from literature, which is great because I had never read Paul Celan before. I had his poetry and his fiction. You have excerpts from, you have a whole poem by Itzhak Manger. You have excerpts from a lot of literature of the Holocaust and some about the Holocaust written after. But I was really struck by the things written during the Holocaust by Jewish writers. You have excerpts from Katzenelson's poem, the Song of the Murdered Jewish People, which he wrote while he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, awaiting his death, basically, and things that people wrote afterwards. And so I'm glad, on the one hand, that you include that and you go into such detail about those types of literature, but on the other hand, that it's not some writers, all they think about when they think of Jewish literature is the Holocaust, and you don't do that. So you contextualize and you include, and I think that's really beneficial and again, introduced me to writers of that genre that I was not familiar with.
See, what you're saying now ties in with what you said at the beginning. And I'll respond by showing this to the readers, which exemplifies what I was saying about translations. This book by Yitzhak Katzenelson is called The Song of the Murdered Jewish People. It's a trilingual edition in Yiddish, Spanish, and Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. Here it says Yiddish, Castilian, and Judeo-Spanish, published by Erde. The book contains the poems in all three languages, and there are even facsimiles of the handwritten pages because this man died in the concentration camp, and the poems were found inside a bottle with the sheets of paper rolled up inside a bottle. So, when we see the text in Yiddish and that it has been translated into Judeo-Spanish, which is the other Jewish language in this volume, and I know, Stephen, that you know both worlds, Yiddish and Ladino, we recognize the huge gaps in our knowledge, because I only learned about this book shortly after this edition came out. I don't remember the year, but it's maybe 10 to 15 years old. I have the date here. 2015. It was sent to me 10 years ago. I would never have come across it. The others, like Paul Celan, for example, Paul Celan is considered the most important German language poet of the second half of the 20th century, but he remains very unknown in Spain and probably in the United States as well. And he has poems of an impressive metaphysical depth. Perhaps he is the poet who best captured every aspect of the Shoah. And interestingly, he disproves Adorno's cliché that you can't write poetry after Auschwitz. For me, that's just a provocation from Theodor Adorno.
Well, I understand what he was trying to say, but yeah, I don't entirely buy it. So
yes, the reason why he said it is clear, but he was wrong. Because 80 years have passed and the Jewish people are still alive. And yes, we must keep writing poetry, even if they're tragic poems rather than romantic or pretty. But I believe that the heritage of the Jewish people is found in books and writing. And so literature is a part of that.
All right. Well, again, the title of the book is When Einstein Met Kafka, Jewish Contributions to the Modern World. You buy it and you can keep busy reading it for a good long time because it's, again, voluminous. Whatever area of human culture and endeavor you are interested in, there is probably a chapter about it in this book. Thank you again, Diego, for taking the time to talk about the book.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.